Okay, we're back. We had some technical difficulties, but we are back.
We are back, and welcome back everyone to Tactical Edge Virtual Summit. We are in our third day. We have amazing speakers today, and now we are with Jerry Bell. How are you, Jerry?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, thank you. You have the after lunch spot.
The dreaded after lunch.
That's quite all right.
Yeah.
I'm sure people will be engaged.
People is getting ready for your presentation. We are going to tell you, we are going to tell who you are. So Jerry Bell is VP and CISO of IBM Public Cloud. He has worked in the security industry for over 20 years and is passionate about learning and teaching others about how security breaches occur and what we can do to help avoid them. To that end, Jerry founded and co-hosts the Defensive Security Podcast. And I know your podcast is really famous and you have a lot of people that is following you and that likes to hear your podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
And let me say, Jerry, we go a long way. He came with us and he was a Tactical Edge in Bogota with Andy at the same time that Andy Ellis was there. Very happy that Bogota is still intact because you get the double whammy of Mr. Ellis and Mr. Malicious Link there. Also want to congratulate Jerry for his new role at IBM. As I was telling him before, he's about to be Mr. IBM. He started taking charge of the dumpsters at IBM. Is that correct, Jerry?
No.
with all the dumpster fires and everything. and Jerry's well known for being a llama lover. Tell us, Jerry, why the llama with you?
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's
it's an interesting story. I guess it was about 6 or 7 years ago, there was a pretty widely publicized story of a couple of llamas running around, I think it was Phoenix, city in Arizona. And on one of my podcast episodes, I made a pretty bad joke about llamas. And after that on Twitter, I just heard no end of it. And I started getting llama paraphernalia mailed to me in mass quantities. And so it's basically stuck, right? The llama has become my persona on Twitter. And I will admit I've never actually petted a llama. So I feel like that's a deep, dark secret I'm admitting right here.
Weren't we close to, though, in front of the Museo del Oro in Bogota with the llama, that we almost took a photo with you and Andrew and all the guys? Oh, that was too funny. But anyway, Jerry, tell us what's before we start, I want to say thank you again to our sponsors. Very important, our sponsors, Ativo Networks, SailPoint, Exabeam, and CyberArk. And Sama, you have a recommendation to our attendees?
Go to our sponsors area. Please visit them because they have prepared some special activities for you and they have a special material that you can download. So please go and visit our sponsors.
Please.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
As you can tell, I changed my camera. I'm no longer freaking Mr. Orange, but now it's a weird camera looking up, so I apologize. It's either that or Orange Man. So, but anyway, Jerry, we leave you.
Welcome to Tactical Edge. The stage is yours.
All right,
Jerry.
thank you for having me. Let me start presenting here.
There you go.
All right,
Perfect.
Excellent. So again, thank you for having me. My talk today is called Back to Basics. A lot of conference talks get really down into the weeds on some pretty esoteric topic, and one of the things I've learned as I've run the Defensive Security Podcast is a lot of times it's not the really obscure, cool, sexy control that ends up helping you. It's it's the basics. And so I want to talk about that with all of you today. So just a first thing, a little bit more about me. You both gave me a good introduction. I throughout this deck, I do have some quotes from my alter ego, which is Sun Tzu Cyber. I have been, as you mentioned, I've been in security for a very long time. I've co-host and founded the Defensive Security Podcast. And by the way, that was that was out of a desire to really learn about why breaches were happening and hopefully figure out how to avoid that myself. And in the process, I came to realize that this is not a unique need, right? There's a whole lot of things to learn based on what's happening out in the world. And so I took it upon myself to try to make the world a better place through the podcast. So getting into the discussion a bit, I think we're all pretty familiar with what's happening in the threat landscape. We continue to see a pretty significant march towards more advanced techniques. And so what was once the domain of the APT, the nation state actor, are becoming more commodity type attacks. And so the margins that we have to deal with are becoming thinner and thinner in terms of making sure that we're protecting our environments. At the same time, the sheer number of breaches are driving some interesting behaviors kind of globally. Regulators have sat up and taken notice and released some really significant pieces of legislation like the GDPR in Europe, the CCPA in California, the LGPD down in Brazil, and many others in an attempt to help protect the personal data of people. And then even in Europe, we have regulations like the NIS directive, which are a little different in purpose, focused more on infrastructure protection rather than data protection. So that's also led to an interesting situation where the executives of most organizations are now quite familiar with security, right? You can't turn on CNBC here in the US, which is a big business news channel, without seeing advertisements for different cybersecurity firms. And anytime there is a breach, all of the major news networks have different subject matter experts from different companies come in and give their perspective. So it's created this situation of awareness, which on the one hand is a very good thing, but on the other hand has also opened the door for the growing or the burgeoning cybersecurity industry. And the interesting thing there is that there's a vendor who can solve whatever problem you have, whether or not it's the actual problem you really need to solve. As my co-host Andy Callett says, that vendors are there to solve the problem you have with what they have available, right? And that is different than what you actually need. So it kind of created this interesting dynamic where sometimes the controls that we need to implement are not what we're being fed to implement. So having said that, again, I'm focused on, I get focused on the basics. When I look across and do research for my podcast, I find that at their core, many breaches aren't happening because we don't have some sophisticated artificial intelligence control in place. They happen because we've done some very basic thing in a in a sub way, or we've made some mistake, or we've made some bad risk decision, and that's what I really want to focus on. And I feel very sorry, I'm getting a message that my connection is unstable, so I apologize if I'm breaking up for you.
Yeah, if you want to remove or stop your video, that'll be fine too.
All right, I'll do that. Give me 1 second. One of the awesome things about COVID days is that kids are home, and when kids are home, movies are streamed, and when movies are streamed, the bandwidth is bad. So my apologies there. All right, so moving on. Here's the problem I see with basics, and this is both from personal experience and also looking across what's been happening in many of the publicly reported data breaches. There's a few common elements that I see. First is that, very simply, IT and security architecture are not an engineering discipline or a science. They're really a trade craft. And what that means is there's a very wide array of ways to do the same thing with technology. And each way you can do that presents different types of risk. So it takes a very creative person to understand what threats face your specific environment. And that dovetails into the second finding that I've noticed, which is when we make risk decisions, we often lack an understanding of what can actually go wrong, because we really don't have the context around how systems and applications and networks can be abused by adversaries. And so that leads us to make decisions, to either do something or not do something out of ignorance, right? And then next is the commoditization of IT. There was a time not long ago when IT really had to be, driven by a team of experts. And now with the advent of cloud and the rapidly dropping price of computers and whatnot, and by the way, the increased demand from businesses for agility, we're seeing a lot of I guess call it shadow IT, right? A lot of entrepreneurship within organizations when it comes to configuring IT, and that leads again to very similar types of situations above, where the people who are creating these types of environments are really ignorant, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but they just really often don't understand what it takes to properly secure things. So, and then obviously, one of the interesting things that I have observed, having run the podcast for a long time, is I get a whole lot of email, and one of the most common questions, after the most common question is, how do I get into cybersecurity? And the second most popular question is, how do I get my management to support what I'm doing? So it's also a very common problem we have. So today I want to focus on one basic technique that I see done incorrectly or incompletely very, very commonly. And this leads to untold issues. And I would say, if you look around at most of the modern contemporary types of attacks we see today, ransomware, and whatnot, least privilege is at its core. And it's interesting because least privilege is such a basic concept. It's something that we learn in our CISSP class. If we take computer science classes in college, it's in the introductory course. It's a very intuitive concept. It's not very novel, but at the same time, it's also something that we consistently get wrong. Now, I think, again, we all have a very strong intuition on least privilege, so I don't think I'm telling people anything innovative here. We've all, anybody who's worked in security or IT in general for any amount of time is familiar with, the quote, "I need administrator rights because I have to do my job, and therefore, because I need that to do my job, least privilege has been achieved." And maybe that's true, but I would argue in most cases that is in fact not true, and it typically is born out of a lack of understanding and, candidly, laziness. It's often very difficult, maybe not difficult, right? But it's more time consuming, more complexity to go and figure out the right way to configure permissions from a logical access perspective. But logical access is really not not the most interesting aspect of least privilege to me, but Active Directory certainly is. So Active Directory, for anybody, by the way, who has listened to my podcast or knows me, knows that I have a very strong love-hate relationship with Active Directory. And in fact, most people think I actually really hate it. And I would say that is absolutely not true. What I really hate is how most organizations use Active Directory. And that's particularly frustrating because Microsoft has gone out of their way. I would say they've invested very heavily in creating a lot of guidance on how to configure Active Directory in a secure manner. But we see evidence all the time that doesn't happen. Anytime you look at, well, maybe not any time, but many times when you read about large-scale ransomware cases with the recent Soda no Kibi and Ryak and many of the others, take advantage of misconfigured permissions in Active Directory. So that leads me to some story time. The first story I have is related to NotPetya. NotPetya, for those of you who were not around just a couple of years ago, NotPetya was a piece of malware that was distributed allegedly by Russians. There's some debate about whether or not it was cyber war or whatnot, but I'm going to set all that hoopla aside and say that this, it was a piece of malware that propagated and destroyed data on systems that it landed on. One of the main way it propagated was by collecting credentials out of memory and then trying to connect to systems on adjacent networks. And when things got really hairy was when it landed on a system of an administrator, system administrator who had access to lots of different systems. It was at that point game on, and that's really problematic. Again, given the fact that Microsoft has helped us understand what we need to do. What really would have helped in that, I will say, I have seen organizations that fell victim very hard to NotPetya, and I also saw organizations that survived almost unscathed. And the ones that survived unscathed either didn't have a big Windows or Active Directory footprint, or they had actually followed Microsoft's guidelines. And the challenge with those Microsoft guidelines is that they're pretty onerous. They require reconfiguration of your domain. But I would say the most troublesome aspect of Microsoft's guidance is that it affects the IT people. It affects IT and security people. It's not a set of controls that you put upon the user population en masse. It is a series of controls that are intended to properly protect the administrative credentials that your IT staff are interacting with, and it requires a lot of hygiene on workstations. It's one of the most recognizable of those controls, but I would say also the least sophisticated, is not is having two different domain IDs, one that's not privileged for doing things like checking email, and another that is used for performing administrative tasks. But again, that's this is pretty standard fare. I don't think that's big news for anyone. But what is news is that concept extends beyond just the ID. It also extends into the workstations that you use, and fencing those workstations off from other parts of your network so that they are they are not susceptible to worms. And if you do in fact need to use that same workstation to perform some unprivileged tasks, you do that in a virtual machine. So there's a lot of prescription and guidance in doing that, and it is a little unpleasant, especially if you are going from a situation where you don't have those controls in place to one where you do. It can be a fairly big shock, and my experience in IT for a few decades is that IT people really don't like to have those kinds of controls put on them. So that's not NotPetya. I do believe that if we are able to really get least privilege under control with respect to Active Directory, most organizations will end up pretty resilient to many of the types of attacks we're seeing today. Not all, and we're going to talk about a couple of exceptions that require additional controls. The other story I have is from a company that I helped respond to a breach on, and obviously I can't talk about who or when and where and whatnot, but it was a fairly large, recognizable company, and this particular company had come to know that they had an intruder, they had an adversary rooting around on their internal network. And in the investigation, what we found was this company had a Windows-based web server sitting out on their external server network. And they wanted to take advantage of the benefits of Active Directory, which it makes good sense. You can do a lot of great things with Active Directory through group policy, centralized user administration. I'm totally bought into all of those benefits. They even went so far as to set up a separate domain controller on that same external network, and they limited access to it. And then they allowed connectivity, because you have to do this, right, between that domain controller and domain controllers in their internal network. What ended up happening was the web server had it was a custom web app that had a local file, or had a file upload vulnerability. And anyway, an adversary uploaded a web shell, and through some magic, they were able to to elevate their privileges on this server. They were able to capture credentials out of the administrative credentials out of the memory of the server, because keep in mind the only users that log into a web server that's out on your external network are going to be administrators for the most part. The adversary then connected to the domain controller from the domain controller on the external network from this web server. And here's where it got a little crazy, at least for this, from the perspective of this particular customer. So far, it's pretty vanilla stuff. The adversary then leveraged the ports that were open between the external domain controller and the internal domain controller, and established, basically they set up a tunnel and were able to use PSExec. Just to give you an example of how they did it, right? They ran PSExec with the credentials they had harvested from the external domain controller to the internal, and at that point, the entire network was theirs. And I will tell you, one of the hardest discussions that I have to have, and I fortunately I don't have to have this kind of discussion with customers anymore, but one of the most difficult discussions I've had to have with customers or the companies like this was, you have to, when this sort of thing happens, typically you have to burn the whole thing down, right? If you have an adversary that's been in your environment for weeks, months, or years, you really don't have any good indication of where they've been, where they've not been. I mean, obviously you can spend incredible amounts of resources trying to figure that out, but it's kind of a difficult and not very fruitful activity. So in any event, this was a case where in the aftermath, I had a discussion with the team that developed or designed the network for this company, and I still hear in the back of my head, still hear them saying, "I had no idea that could happen." And that leads me to the next thing that I want to point out with respect to least privilege, is that the concept extends well beyond logical access, Active Directory, and whatnot. And into other domains, in particular, network access. So right now, we all know zero trust is all the hotness, and for good reason, right? It's a very sensible approach to security. But where that doesn't work is, when you have a really serious and easy to exploit vulnerability that's now just hanging out on the internet. And I pasted an example of a recent situation with F5, and this is just, I'm not picking on F5, right? I think this sort of thing happens all the time, but this is an example where least privilege applied to network can help. In this particular case, the vulnerability existed on the management interface of these F5 big IP appliances. And one would have to ask, if you were applying the principles of least privilege, does it make sense for the administrative interface of a device like this to be accessible to the internet? And I would say, no. And that concept permeates into where my heart lives now, off in the cloud. Cloud is a great thing, and in many ways, it creates a lot of opportunities, but also creates some new complexities. So I feel like to some extent we've taken a really long time to get our arms around traditional IT and how to properly secure traditional IT. Not that we ever got awesome at it, but now we're moving everything to the cloud. And that adds immense new capabilities, but with those new capabilities comes a lot of complexity that we have to be aware of and cognizant of. So a pretty interestingly named recent attack against NoSQL databases was called Meow. And this was a headline from some news at the time. What I can only assume was a security researcher gone awry, wrote a script that went around and connected to open NoSQL databases and effectively replaced the contents of the database with the word meow. And if you're wondering, that is that picture is of my cat, who is named Thor. So I think I'm making it my mission to now include Thor in each of my conference presentations. So my view, by the way, is that cloud is kind of the next, the next horizon of challenges that we have to overcome from a complexity standpoint. There's no net in traditional IT. It used to be, especially in larger organizations, it used to be pretty difficult to get things connected to a network or especially connected to the internet. But now with the advent of cloud, it's all right there. It's very, very easy to make a mistake. And I will say, there was I think most people recognize this particular incident, and I don't mean to pick on Capital One because they screwed up. I mean to point out that Capital One is a very mature company, and they have, I would argue, some of the smartest IT and security people there probably are, but they made a mistake, and the reason they made a mistake is because it's complicated. But this is, again, the problem that befell them was one of least privilege. They had a challenge where their WAF had the ability to obtain IAM credentials to access their S3 bucket. Now, there's really no good reason for that to have happened. I strongly suspect it wasn't done intentionally. Again, it's a complicated environment. So speaking of S3 buckets, this has been such a problem in the industry that we've actually seen entire companies launched to fix this or to chase this, right? I can name 3 or 4 companies right off the top of my head that have risen because of this particular problem. You can hire companies to monitor for for buckets that you own being improperly exposed. There's threat intel companies who will monitor exposed buckets and let you know if your data is in there. Again, this is yet another example of least privilege. And again, I suspect that very few of these organizations that have these S3 buckets sitting open actually intended to do that. This is almost certainly a failure to understand how to secure and configure the technology that they're using, which goes back to again, the basic concept that we need to understand. We need to understand how to configure and secure the services that we're using, and that is no more important than it is in. It's no more important anywhere else than it is in cloud. So I would encourage you, as we go forward and the world continues to migrate to cloud for a lot of extremely valuable reasons, to ensure that your teams are upskilled and have the understanding of how to configure and secure the various components of cloud, whichever cloud provider you use. There's a lot of commonality between them, but also some some significant differences. But it's really important that you don't end up in this kind of situation with S3. So, I'll leave you with this. Least privilege is not a sexy control. It is a basic thing. It is something we learn early in our career. And I fear that many of us, because it is so basic, just take it for granted and believe that we understand the risk trade-offs that we're making when we go off and decide to either do or not do something with respect to permissions. But as well, we need to make sure that we understand where we have gaps in our knowledge, right? So again, kind of back to the cloud concept. But in any event, the point is, it's not an AI-based security control that operates on blockchain in the cloud, but it still is highly effective against many of the advanced threats that we see today. And I will also say, I will take that a little bit further and say, many of the AI-based blockchain security solutions in the cloud make an assumption that you have the basics nailed, right? That the basics are operating as they should. And I will further say that personally, I've been party to many different vendor pitches where or vendor demos where the demonstration works amazing, and then we buy it and we implement it, and it's nothing but trouble. And one of the reasons I would say, in my experience, that it typically is so problematic is because there's fundamental gaps in in these basic security controls that the technology you're trying to implement relies on. So I would encourage everybody to take a step back, continue to focus on the basics, and let's try to keep our data safe. So I do want to say thank you to Edgar and Tactical Edge for letting me talk to all of you today. You can see the links to my podcast and blog, and you can also follow me on Twitter at @maliciousLink. So thank you again for your time, everyone. I hope you have a great day. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference here, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Jerry. Thank you. That was quick, but that's cool because it allows us to have a nice set of conversations here. So one of the things that you mentioned that, and I may just be making this simpler than the statement, but complicated environments makes executing the basics difficult.
Yes.
So how do we do it? Because I haven't seen one environment that isn't complicated.
Well, I think there's shades of gray. I would say, right? Most IT environments are quite complicated, but depending on how you are architected, it's it can be easier or harder to get right. So if you have everything sitting out on the internet, you have no margin for error, right? So another one of the basics that I didn't talk about is the whole model of defense in depth, because it is difficult, right? It is very difficult to get things right. There's no magic here. Right. At the end of the day, today, security takes smart people doing smart things. Maybe at some point in the future, we'll have a we'll have some AI machine where you can feed in a network map and it'll show you all of the things you need to do. But right now, as we sit here today, it takes smart people who have the creativity to understand how things can go wrong, to figure out the most effective way to secure your environment. And look, it's not a deterministic thing, right? People make mistakes, and we have to learn from them, which is, again, the whole point of this, right? We see people doing it wrong all the time, and we can learn from that.
Always. And that's basically one of the messages from Andy Ellis's presentation this morning, is the pre-mortem and then post-mortem, right? There's no wrong answers. You learn from everything. You learn from all this stuff. And I believe that Stephen Moore from Exabeam said the same thing yesterday. And just because you had a breach doesn't mean that it can be negative. You can learn from everything. It's just the question: how do you react and what you do next? You mentioned something that was very, again, I like your style because you go straight to the point and make it sound very basic, very easy. Common sense. Ensure that your team has an understanding of how to configure cloud-based solutions. If you're going to have somebody configure a cloud-based Amazon or whatever, you have to make sure that they are properly trained. And otherwise, again, going back to the basics. But that's, again, easier said than done, because a lot of companies don't have the budget for training. And so what do you do?
At the end of the day, I mean, you can either have people who understand how to configure and secure the technology you're using, or you're taking a risk, right? I mean, at some level, just being in business is a risk, right? So on the one hand, it's difficult for us to, as presenters, to get up here and preach about, how to do things the right way. But the reality is, businesses have to do what they have to do, obviously within certain guardrails. But my view is, if you're gonna embark on some new technology like cloud, you have, it's just table stakes. You have to have people who understand how to how to configure it. And by the way, I would say, to aspiring security and IT people, this is where it's at, right? Cloud is the future, whether you like it or not. I have lots of people who still are clinging on to their data centers with their dying breath. But the reality is, cloud is coming. It's it may take a very long time for it to displace everything, but I think over time, most everybody's going to be consuming their IT through some cloud type of service. We'll see what that looks like in the future. But in the meantime, this is the opportunity we have, and I would encourage people, to get ahead of that, right? So if you want to be marketable, if you want to have skills that are in demand, this is where to be, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back to implementing the basics, least privilege. I want to do it. What is the first step? How do I accomplish that? And let's say I'm a medium-sized company, just 500 users. How do I accomplish that?
Well, so the way I would approach it is, starting from the highest risk and working down. And for most organizations, that is in fact Active Directory. And I know that I beat on that drum a lot. And I'm not saying that we should throw it out. I'm saying that we should start with the basics. Start with where we're going to make the most bang for our buck, and then the place we're going to do that is by picking up the guidance that Microsoft publishes around the privilege tiering concept, And actually, it's handy because Microsoft actually gives you a roadmap. They basically say, here's the first thing you should do, and then here's the second thing you should do, here's the third thing you should do, and it gives you a plan of action. That's the place that I would start, and then you start getting into more of the esoteric things. Looking at applications, right? Do we have, are we giving everybody administrative rights to our accounting application, and just kind of starting at the top and working down. That's how I would proceed.
Okay. On the cloud perspective, since now you're you basically own IBM Cloud, right? Public cloud. That's your baby now.
Hardly own, but am very honored and happy to help protect it. Yes.
Excellent. What is one of the basic recommendations you tell your clients from a security perspective, other than make sure that your people are trained and cognizant and experienced on setting this up?
So we spent, I would say, like Microsoft, we spend a lot of time developing design patterns on how to properly design and secure different types of environments. So I would say, paying attention to those. Another would be recognizing that there isn't magic security dust that surrounds servers that are running in the cloud, right? If you, as a customer, configure a server in an insecure manner on the cloud, it's really not different than if you have an insecure server in a traditional environment, right? So, we see, and I think our experience is not necessarily different than other places, right? You got the same types of issues. People leave servers exposed on sensitive services exposed, and people use weak passwords. They get brute forced, and bing bang boom. Suddenly you're spamming people, or you're mining bitcoins, or what have you. So it's basic security hygiene, right? Now, when you start getting into the more complex cloud native stuff, where you are using different APIs and whatnot, it starts to get more complicated, because now you're talking about ensuring that you're properly protecting your API keys, and that's a topic that is so deep it would warrant its own
its own
conversation.
5-day event.
Conference. Yes. Exactly.
In your security podcast, Defensive Security Podcast, with our good friend Andrew Callat, what horror story is there? One horror story that you have? I tell you mine, because this happened, I believe it was last year, where an S3 bucket like that exposed the data of every single citizen in Ecuador. I mean, that's the whole freaking country. I don't think you can get any worse than that. But do you have any stories that you guys discussed in your?
Wow, it's so we've been going now for 8 years, and we've covered WannaCry and NotPetya. We've covered so many of the major stories. The ones that were, I think, the most both interesting and troubling were the ones where the companies didn't survive. And I'm thinking it was a cloud-based company. I'm forgetting. Oh, it was Cloud Spaces. That was the name of the company. Or was it Code Spaces? I'm one of the downsides of getting old is you start forgetting. But anyway, it was basically a competitor to GitHub, and I believe they were in AWS. And the details escape me. It was several years ago right now, but basically some adversary had figured out a way to log into their cloud console and deleted everything. So the company actually did a pretty good job of setting up backups, and they were spread across different regions in AWS and whatnot. But one thing they made a mistake on was their backups, like their entire estate was in the same cloud account. And what happened was, they went to bed on a Thursday, and then on a Friday they came up and everything was gone. There was nothing left.
Oof.
And so it's those sorts of stories that are for me the most troubling, right? Because it's like actual people lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And that that's really quite unfortunate. It's there's been certainly lots and lots of stories about massive credit card breaches, although those seem to be slowing down for probably some good reasons. But at least here in the US, it's certainly a problem for the banks, but from an individual perspective, it's if your credit card gets stolen and used here in the US, typically you're indemnified from any abuse of the charges. That's not, by the way, that's not a universal thing, right? There are places where that's not, as I understand it, that's not true. But where you have people whose deeper data, like their information about in the US, the social security number and address and driver's license number, where where it enables identity theft and whatnot. That is, I've known several people who have been the victim of identity theft, and that is a really terrible experience to undergo. And then when you think about that happening at scale, like to thousands of people, and what all those people are about to go through, it's it is quite disheartening.
Yeah, that's those are the consequences that a lot of the time we don't think about until actually happen to us or to somebody that we know. Last question, Jerry. Newly minted CISO. Are you implementing this basics without going into detail? I mean, do you find yourself, going and finding out where we are, what do we need to do, how do we apply the basics?
Absolutely, and I think everybody should, right? I mean, that's I would question a CISO who feels like they shouldn't do that, right? Because it says that you're not, you're not getting down into the weeds enough to understand what's actually happening. So yes, but it's obviously it's a process, but yes.
Okay, so with that, while we wait for our next and last speaker, Mitch, to join us, I want to say well, thank you, Jerry, for your time. And what was your cat's name again? Thor,
the god of thunder.
The god of thunder. Yeah, we just got ourselves a new kitty. Actually, he adopted us, and we're trying to introduce him to our Rollo, the Viking King. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, Thor is a good name. So
good luck. We named him that because he has this super loud meow. But after we got him, we quickly learned that he was terrified of thunder, which is just the most ironic thing ever.
Oh, that is hilarious. That is hilarious. All right, Jerry, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, buddy.
Bye.
Talk later.
Bye. Bye, Jerry.